I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. I'll start with the standard question. Would you please introduce yourself and tell us about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my name's Micah Hanks, and of course, I have a lot of interests, a lot like yourself, Samuel. Primarily, since childhood, I've been fascinated with what here in the United States, the military currently uses unidentified aerial phenomena or unidentified anomalous phenomena to characterize and describe, but they're historically known as UFOs. I also, of course, am very interested in and have been pretty involved in anthropological and archaeological studies here in the United States as well. But I like to travel like yourself. And so I do that as often as possible. And over the last few years, despite the COVID pandemic, I've had the benefit of being able to spend time in South America. Right before the pandemic, I was in Portugal, as you know, and Canada and all parts of the contiguous 48 over the last year. So indeed, it's been nice to be able to get back out there and see the beautiful world that we live in.
Wonderful. Yes, well, so some of my listeners may be asking why I'm having you on board. And my listeners are also going to know that this video interview program, some might even call it a podcast, be that as it may, right, was sort of loosely inspired, right, by my position as co-editor in actually a couple books, right, on the origins of language and number, the origins and applications of language and number. The inspiration was a conference I attended a few years ago, which featured Noam Chomsky, and how does all of that relate to tonight? Well, I'll put it this way: the question of UAPs or UFOs, right, it's been in the news a lot the last couple of years, and we'll get into that in a minute. But always with that subject, what intrigues me personally, right, from a cognitive science or linguistic perspective, are questions like, well, if we were to encounter extraterrestrial intelligence, first, would we even be able to recognize it? Would we even know it? And if so, what would be the prospects of being able to communicate with that? So, right, so that's sort of one of my main interests in this very exotic subject, right? And also, I could do what you have done on your own program, and that is invite really eminent experts like Avi Loeb, Brian Keating. But hey, it's much easier just to reach out to someone like you who has already spoken with all of those people. And so I can tap into everything you've learned from them, right, from your interviews with them. And so it makes my job a little easier, even though I do hope to have Brian Keating on at some point. But anyway, all right. So to help orient my audience here, can you give us a little bit of overview of what's been going on in the press, especially the last just couple of years, right, involving the Pentagon, right, and things that we have heard referred to as the tic tac and all of this? Can you just give a brief summary of what's been happening with this subject the last few years and why it's different?
Certainly. I'll be glad to, and I'll very briefly preface that just by saying, of course, that you and I share a lot of similar interests. And in fact, your scholarly work has been influential on me well outside of the purview of this subject. But some of its applications, both indirect but also at times direct, are important. And I think something that have continued with my own scientific assessment of this, or attempts at trying to look at this, from a scholarly and historically oriented perspective. So all that said, in terms of your question and really the overview of what's been happening in recent years, which some would say is the sort of nuts and bolts aspect of this, which is a little less intellectually stimulating in terms of possibilities related to all the aforementioned topics. As a journalist, which is I guess my primary line of work with regard to the debrief.org, which is a website that I co-founded with gentleman by the name of Tim McMillan and also MJ Benias, and we have a wonderful team of people who are continuing to look at a range of different issues, disruptive technology, science and space, all these kind of issues of the 21st century. When we go back to 2017, most would recognize that as kind of being this shift, this moment where this dialogue began to significantly shift. As you know, I've been involved in and interested in the pursuit of questions or answers to questions about the UAP issue, and had even been using that terminology, UAP, at least by around 2014, certainly by 2015. In 2017, when we saw the New York Times publishing a article that was looking at first the Department of Defense and its involvement. Actually, it was a program we would come to learn, and more on this in a moment, but we would come to learn that it had actually been housed within the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. But at that time, in 2017, it was reported that there was a Pentagon UAP initiative called ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It was reported at that time that this was run by Mr. Luis Elizondo, and that this program essentially assessed a variety of different aerospace phenomena and the potential national security challenges that might result from their presence in our airspace. After that, I mean, this was the shot heard around the world, and everyone kind of looked at this and said, okay, so a few of the immediate takeaways are, despite its official position, that the department no longer looked at this. And in fact, doing a little of internet archaeology, we can go on Wayback Machine and look at the Department of Defense page that it had. It had a fact page about UAP, which it still referred to as UFOs, that I think remained on the site, defense.gov, at least until as recently as 2014. And it stated that, the department no longer looks at this issue. And then it provided a lot of the findings of the Air Force's Project Blue Book and the Condon Committee and certain other things like that dating back many decades. The important point here is that concomitant with that being on their website, when this actually appeared on their website, we now know that this program was actually taking place. This was being run. There were official investigations and inquiries being made. Informally, they continued even after funding for that program ended. And of course, they have continued in various iterations right up to the present day with what is now called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. So in 2017, when the story first broke, a incident that took place in 2004 off the California coast, which had been known in certain circles. It had actually been written about by a former fighter pilot and blogger, Paco Cherici. He had written an excellent account of this story told by a colleague of his, also a former fighter pilot and commander, named David Fravor. How in 2004, in service to the USS Nimitz, Carrier Strike Group 11, I believe, they had been doing planned training operations off the California coast, and radar operators aboard the USS Princeton began to detect anomalous tracks on radar. Now, a quick technical point on this, because it's very important, I think, for people to understand that this was just after that fleet had been upgraded to new Raytheon technologies, specifically the phased array radar systems, the AN-SPY-1 Bravo, but also the targeting pod tracking capabilities of the infrared target camera known as the ATFLIR targeting pod. These Raytheon technologies greatly expanded the ability for detection and tracking of a variety of different phenomena, but obviously they were designed for tracking aircraft. What was unusual was that the radar operators aboard the Princeton were detecting faint traces off the Baja coast, which didn't seem to be consistent with aircraft, but they were interesting enough that at first the operators, Kevin Day and Gary Voorhees, had begun to say, well, maybe there's some sort of a flaw in this new system. These new systems are so sensitive that maybe they're picking up weather, something like that, birds. So they reset the systems to try and determine if there's a issue with the actual software. And after a hard restart, they noticed that they're still picking up these traces. And this continues for a few weeks. So finally, on one occasion, they decided to vector aircraft out to one of the locations where they were continuing to detect one of these targets. Lo and behold, the story is that first, a military pilot had been in the vicinity, and he had seen some sort of turbulence at the surface of the water. But shortly thereafter, as he turns back, Commander David Fravor and another pilot who remained unnamed for a while, but it's now been revealed that was Alex Dietrich, and their weapons systems officers, they're flying out there, and they not only see this turbulence, but also some sort of an object that, as Fravor has termed it, it seemed to be moving erratically over the surface of the water. And he flies down to take a closer look. The object orients itself in his direction and then flies past him, and he says disappears.
Mhm.
So it immediately, this aircraft or object exhibits what appear to be very anomalous capabilities in terms of, well outside the scope of known aircraft. And then it was reported thereafter by the radar operators at the Princeton that this object appeared to be at their so-called cap point, the designated location that they used for communications, in orienting themselves that day within the context of these training operations. Fravor returns, and then he alerts another weapons systems officer, Mr. Chad Underwood, who at the time I think was a lieutenant. He's now a commander. That he should be on the lookout. And when he goes out, they again notice this anomalous target aboard the Princeton. So the radar operator's Vector Underwood out there, he observes the target at least through his infrared camera and is able to get a lock on that object, which he said was actively trying to jam their radar.
Mhm.
And seemed to be using other evasive maneuvers, what some might call signature management. But he cycles through, films it for at least a few seconds, and then loses the track, and the object leaves the field of view. And he turns back and he has this footage, which was leaked online thereafter. So coming back to Paco Cherici, this story was written up on his blog. The video even surfaces at one point, and Paco sees this, and he says, I've told several people about it. But it didn't really gain much traction until 2017 in the New York Times as a supplement to the article on the ATIP program. They featured an interview with Fravor, and at that time, they released or re-released that same footage that had already been in the wild for many years, but 2 new instances of a purported UAP that were captured using the AT-FLIR targeting pod, this time by personnel aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt between 2014 and 2015 off the East Coast. So long story short, those were really the events that kind of reinvigorated the debate on UFOs, now characterizing them as UAP, but also I think brought, I believe, a necessary attention to this subject that really had been kind of underway for a long time, but more behind the scenes. And now it's sort of had this effect of breaking the proverbial glass ceiling. So now we have, rather than a very quiet program, an informal initiative run out of the DIA. And actually backing up for a moment about that, the DIA program that was funded, that ran for a couple of years around 2010, was called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, but it had an unclassified nickname, which was ATIP. At one point, Senator Harry Reid had wanted to try and get special access program status for the program,
Right.
and so it had to have an unclassified nickname, which is pretty standard procedure within government. So that's what they did. They gave it this nickname, ATIP, which allegedly was taken and then thereafter borrowed as the name of the informal initiative that Lou Elizondo led. So there was some confusion about that initially, even as a result of the reporting in the New York Times. But as more information has come forward, we can establish the lineage as being OSAP, and then the informal ATIP, which was an interagency task force, which thereafter was somewhat formalized and dubbed the UAP Task Force in 2020. And then after that, I think it had another name for just a short period, the AIMSOG, as they called it, and that name was so convoluted and complex that eventually Congress mandated that there was a new name, and now that's the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which we currently have within the DoD. So that's a very short history of everything from 2017 to now, where we are, and really how we kind of got here. And it's a fascinating process to look back on and see how quickly things have escalated, and how much we're now seeing scholarly attention. NASA's conducting a study, and of course the DoD seems to be involved in trying to evaluate these objects. So it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think that there's been some, let's call it just I'm not trying to make any enemies here in the audience, but I probably will, but so be it. Do you think there's been some exaggeration, right, in reaction to the development of this story? And what I mean is this: we've seen some headlines in some sources, right, that, well, finally, right, the Pentagon acknowledges UFOs or UAP exist, right, and this is almost or explicitly equated with, right, the Pentagon acknowledges extraterrestrials, right, are visiting us. Right. And this is not what the Pentagon acknowledged. The Pentagon simply acknowledged, and correct me here, that's your role if you need to, that these films that had been released, right, are not forgeries. They're, they're actual films, film footage from our military. And that's what was admitted, not what they are, right? And not what, just not what they are. So, but what do you think of where I'm coming from there?
Oh yeah, no, very, very, very good question. Because I think that if we look back at the history of aerial phenomena, and again, I also would include in this context things that we might consider natural sources of, luminous phenomena in nature or other aerial phenomena that have dazzled the eyes of people since time immemorial, but which today, through the lens of science, we might better understand and can account for. The human response to those stimuli is always at the heart of what UAP is. In other words, UAP, one definition of it might, rather than being tangible objects of unknown origin, I mean, that's what we generally mean when we use UAP in modern parlance. But when I think about unidentified aerial phenomena, I think, from antiquity to the present, the human experience of people looking at the sky, observing things they can't identify, and then ascribing agency to them. And back in the day, if it was a meteor or if it was an aurora, people did that. Oh, look, there was a battlefield in the sky and there were soldiers equipped with swords and shields. There were flying shields that were seen in the sky. There were sky ships dropping anchors and things like this. There were angels, there were demons. So the point is, that's the tradition. Humans always do that. And in the context of modern sensational reporting, Pentagon says they've confirmed strange objects in the sky, but no sign of aliens. We often see that. There are those hopefuls who are saying if the Pentagon has established that there are objects of unknown origin in our skies, and that this technology they represent or appear to represent is far beyond our known capabilities and therefore in likelihood doesn't belong to China or Russia, then it must be aliens. Many do lead with that presumption. On the other side of that equation, I look at reporting since 2017, for instance, in the New York Times that has said things like, the Pentagon is certain that these are not extraterrestrial aircraft, but there are some, anomalous phenomena that we can't identify. So the epistemological question I have there is, well, how do you know they aren't extraterrestrials, right? How do you know what you know if they say that they don't know what some of these are? How can we be certain that they are not this if we don't know what they are? At the end of the day, all that we can really say about UAP, to me, Samuel, is that some of these objects remain unidentified, and that doesn't mean that they are unlike some known technologies or that there are not speculations about what they could represent.
Sure.
But there's no physical proof that absolutely irrefutably confirms that. So yes, many believe that the confirmation of unknowns is therefore tantamount to proof of extraterrestrials. We are not yet to that point. And again, Avi Loeb and others who are currently saying, well, if we can find systems, if we can utilize technologies, including telescopic aid and things like this, to zero in and we can look and we can get a high resolution image of one of these objects and we can look and see if there's a tag on there, printed made in Russia, made in China. As Avi has said, I'll turn this over to the Department of Defense if that turns out to be the case. But if I don't see any kind of evidence that these things are of earthly provenance, I'm going to look at other alternatives. I wonder sometimes, given our current as sophisticated as we think we are, given our current limitations technologically, are we even equipped to be able to make a determination? Which comes back to your earlier question. If we saw aerial phenomena and we were looking at something that represented a truly exotic source, and leave that not only in the realm of possible ET. I mean, let's look at any other kind of possibilities that UAP might represent. There are a lot of other possibilities, some of them less likely than others. Would we be equipped scientifically to make those determinations? I'm not convinced yet that even with the best toys in use by the United States federal government and the current investigations carried out by AARO, which relies on the capabilities of the military, I'm not so sure we necessarily are equipped with enough tools to make any final determinations about what this phenomenon may represent. So unknown is the best way that we can characterize them, but everyone seems to project agency onto that and believe they think what they are.
I suspect you may be correct. Yes. Well, just to do what they call the full disclosure, right? I'm not what's called a debunker, by no means, as you know, I was raised near just some miles from Skunk Works, and in my youth saw some, pretty wild things in the sky that I'm still not able to define or identify, right? So I'm the last one to ridicule anyone who is telling a personal narrative, a personal story of something strange they saw. Well, I give almost anyone the benefit of the doubt, which does not mean I necessarily agree with maybe their interpretation of what they saw might have been, but just I want to make that point. I'm not a debunker, and I don't belittle people, but at the same token, I do think that I know for myself and for people older than I am and younger, right? We're all been raised in the age of sci-fi, Lost in Space, going way back, and well, even before that, right? Sci-fi goes back maybe to what, the silent films in the 1920s or something like that. Then moving forward, right, there was Star Trek, and then Star Wars, and these some people, that I've encountered in various situations almost treat, for instance, Star Wars like a religion. So it seems like they almost have a religious attachment to it and devotion to it. And so I think there is this powerful desire in the entire generation, right, for this sci-fi they've been raised in to be true. And one way it can be true for them is, yeah, these strange things in the sky, that's what they are. There's those things we've been raised with in the sci-fi movies. And they make that connection. And I just don't think we can go there. I mean, scientifically, we have to be very, very wary. And as far as some of the, and again, I'm not debunking, but let's try to be sober about this, right? Are you familiar with Professor Simon Holland? Right, he has a very interesting channel on YouTube. He's done a lot of work for BBC, but he devotes most of his channel to the subject of UAP, and he's come up with some pretty good theories. And he will be the first to admit this doesn't explain every instance, every account, of UAP or UFOs, but these theories may explain quite a bit of them, and some of them are laser, right? So classified laser technology, classified plasma technology, and then the infamous Earth lights, right? And he often brings up the point that isn't it intriguing or even suspicious that so many of these UAP stories are associated with military operations, military installations, and even like nuclear warhead sites. And so, to me, being raised in a family with a lot of connections to the military and intelligence communities, that for me, that just I can't help but immediately suspect, a lot of these accounts of strange objects near these installations or Air Force bases, like Edwards Air Force Base in California, are probably part of some military operation which is designed to test the personnel at these Air Force bases or on the sea, on aircraft carrier, and so there. So for me, it is a possible scenario that these pilots, right, very qualified pilots, who saw these objects that have become famous, right, since 2017, may have been, it's a possibility, may have been witnessing a very classified technology that was designed and being implemented and operated to test and see what the reaction would be on the part of pilots and personnel on aircraft carrier. And I don't think that possibility is usually entertained even by some of these pilots. And yet I know, right, from my connections, that this is in fact a possible scenario that is used And it's not as if everyone on an Air Force base or on a destroyer, right, are informed, right, about everything that's going to be a part of an operation, right? What do you think about that? I mean, and if you want to be critical and say and tell me, hey, some of the stuff you're saying is not credible, do it. That's why you're here. But so I'm just being honest.
I think you should be, and I'll be honest as well, Samuel. I think that a lot of the UAP incidents, especially those involving military that I've read about and learned of, are consistent with some kind of plasma. And
yes, I agree.
there are a variety of different ways that could, potentially be introduced. Some natural, but of course, then there's also the possibility that there are some that may be induced. Like yourself, I've spoken with some individuals who strongly lean toward the possibility that, maybe efforts by the Naval Research Laboratory or, other different agencies over the years, maybe dating back several decades, have worked to try and produce these kinds of things. And again, it's not betraying any secrets to talk about this. I mean, there are mentioned in a lot of books. I refer to a colleague of mine, Greg Bishop, in his book, Project Beta, as well as another colleague of mine, Mark Pilkington, in a book he wrote called Mirage Men, which should serve the basis for a fine documentary film as well. There's quite a bit of discussion about the potential use of technologies that could produce plasma-like illuminative phenomena that are capable of being directed and moved through the sky. Observations by military personnel of these kinds of things, and suspiciously near military bases. So I've heard similar stories about these sorts of things. For instance, there was an incident that occurred a few years ago involving, I believe, the USS Ronald Reagan that a colleague of mine, Dave Beatty, wrote about. I provided some information for Dave with regard to the article that he was doing, and he actually wrote that for us there at the debrief. But he did an excellent investigation, interviewing numerous naval personnel. And essentially what they said looked like a very faint, but nonetheless kind of like a sunlight sort of plasma ball, seemed to hover over the ship, at least for long enough that several people across multiple shifts were all able to observe this. Now, if I'm the commander aboard a naval vessel and there's some sort of an illuminative phenomena hovering aboard our ship, I'm going to be very concerned about that. And the level of disinterest that seemed to prevail with regard to that incident, and the fact that there were personnel aboard the ship that were very clear in saying, we saw this thing, but some of the top brass, so to speak, didn't seem to be as concerned about it. That, to me, yet again, is suggestive of, let's just put it up there. Some of us are going to act disinterested, but maybe others of us can we'll gauge their reaction if they aren't read into what they're seeing and what this thing is. Again, that sounds an awful lot to me like it could have been a similar test of some kind of technology like this. I've even heard speculations that the famous Gulf Breeze sightings going back to the 80s might have had some sort of a relationship to this kind of thing. So now a lot of that does fall into the speculation zone.
Sure.
But there are known technologies that are capable of producing these kind of phenomena, and the notion that the military might test those, and furthermore, that at times gauging human responses might involve tests involving military personnel, they would resolutely say, well, we would never experience something like that and then not be debriefed after the fact. But I don't think we can rule out that possibility. And I think that sometimes that kind of testing certainly could happen. It has to be taken into consideration as a possible explanatory mechanism here, because really, like yourself, I'm not a debunker, but you have to be skeptical and you have to rule out possibilities. And I tend to see a lot of, when people look at the UAP question, they immediately go for, well, let's look at the really weird ones. And in all cases, we're going to determine that these are anomalous and therefore can't be explained. But that doesn't mean that they're exotic. I think that the first question has to be, what mechanisms of earthly provenance could potentially explain this? And never lead with the presumption that, well, we can't explain it, therefore aliens. I always say, if there are earthly technologies that could explain this, then should we view those as being a potentially likely explanation? So again, to circle back around and to your point, I definitely think that that's informed speculation, and that probably a lot of these UAP are experimental technologies.
Well, we probably shouldn't name him, but you and I have a mutual friend who's been deep, right, in the intelligence environment, let's call it that way, for decades. You know, he's the one who shared also that that scenario that does take place, that pilots, military pilots, commanders of aircraft destroyer ships, right, are sometimes tested, right? They're not informed about the test that's going to come, and it often involves, you know, plasma or some, you know, other types of technologies. But what do you think about, right, the videos that have become famous since 2017? I myself have done a lot of camera work, right, and it seems to me that um, the what's usually considered anomalous or extraordinary movements that we see in those videos are really can be easily explained if you have a bit of camera expertise. The various, I'm not saying these are tricks, right? But right, the changing lenses, changing perspective, um, uh, you know, what we see can be easily misinterpreted. The types of movements can be easily misinterpreted as something that is anomalous and impossible, right? Even for a physical object, right? In our gravity system. But um, are you familiar with some of these explanations? Now, and I know some people have tried to quote unquote debunk those videos, but again, I want to distance myself from that. I'm just saying, right, as someone with a little bit of camera knowledge, uh, all of that can be easily explained, right? Right, as um, you know, visual misinterpretations or camera adjustments. Are you familiar with this part of the story?
Certainly, yeah. And if I may, I'll speak just briefly to that
Mhm,
and go in succession from one video to the next. We'll start with the so-called Go Fast video.
mhm,
Again, this is one that was obtained by fighter pilots in service to the USS Theodore Roosevelt sometime between late 2014 and early 2015.
mhm,
That footage appears to show a very fast-moving object, hence the name Go Fast, as it's, you know, speeding along. It looks like it's fairly close
mhm.
to the surface of the ocean, and they're able to get a lock on it. You, of course, have audio for context in those instances where you
Yes.
can hear the pilot saying, "Did you
Mhm,
managed to box it? Wow, look at it go!" You know, and they're really excited. Um, I've heard everything about that video from, you know, the pilots hamming it up and everything, and that being suspicious. I don't doubt in that instance that those pilots believed that they had an object that appeared to be moving really quickly and that they were really excited about the fact that they had
I
so-called
agree.
blocked. What that means is that they had managed to actually get a read on it with the FLIR and got the target tracking capabilities locked on so that it followed the object as you see in that footage.
Yes.
Um, what the determination, the official explanation, and I can say I think official explanation now because although that footage was not officially the suspected cause of that footage was not revealed in the recent 2022 annual report on unidentified aerial phenomena released by the ODNI. Pre-reporting on that report from sources that were familiar with the report's contents,
Mhm,
which keep in mind anyone who's read it at 12 pages long, it said very little.
mhm.
But Julian Barnes, the New York Times reporter, who commented on that and spoke with numerous officials on background, strongly pointed to the conclusion on part of the DoD and its Arrow program, led by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, that essentially what we're seeing is a parallax effect right there.
Yes. Yes.
The object is not as close to the surface of the ocean as it appears to be. It is not moving as quickly as it appears to be. It is the position of the object in relation to the ocean and the aircraft that's filming it that gives that appearance, and it's an illusory effect. So I have to say, and again, I think that I strongly suspect, by the way, that their determination was probably informed very much by skeptic Mick West, who very
Mhm,
well may have actually cracked that one. I think
mhm.
you know they probably used that as a basis for their own analysis, but had told Julian Barnes that their own evaluation led them to the same conclusion. So in this instance, I would say that it seems to be that that is probably the official explanation of that video. We may all be wrong. It could be a tic tac, but Arrow seems to think it's more likely a small object like a balloon, and that it's an illusion that causes the appearance of its movement. Now, the gimbal
And this is not meant, I mean, at least for me too, this is not meant to denigrate the skills of the pilot,
right.
or anything like that. I have nothing but respect for these observers, but
Well,
they are humans.
they are humans, and again, I have respect for pilots too. And like yourself, I have a lot of friends who are pilots, and I've recently spoken with Ryan Graves. In fact, actually, I spoke with a former fighter pilot. We caught up when we were in. I guess we were up in Michigan. No, not Michigan. Where were we? Well, anyway, the point is we were actually involved with a project together, and we sat down and had a beer after this filming. And he told me an excellent story about a UAP that was observed visually. They didn't see it on radar. I'm pretty convinced this fighter pilot and his weapons systems officer did see a quote unquote UAP. That's another story. But the point is, I'm sure that fighters do see these things, and then there are instances where, the all too human ability to observe something we can't explain, but maybe something that we don't have a whole lot of data about, it leads to misperceptions. Really quick example, numerous pilots back in October began to report these so-called racetrack UAPs that were being seen all over the United States and, by pilots en route from Hawaii to the mainland. Turns out a lot of those sightings, maybe not all, but a lot of them were Starlink satellites observed under unusual visual conditions. And even when that was irrefutably demonstrated by Mick West and others, which I spoke with Mick at length about, and I was convinced by Mick's analysis. It wasn't his analysis initially. It was a gentleman who went by the handle Flarkey on the Metabunk forums, but Flarkey and Mick, rather than fighting with them, I engaged in dialogue with them, and they led me to the conclusion, based on the credible argument that they made, that these sightings probably were Starlink. But even Mick contended that not all of the descriptions by pilots necessarily fit that description. So point is, like you say, we don't want to denigrate the pilots. We don't want to try and say that people don't know what they're seeing. But in many instances, there are visual conditions where these so-called UAP fall into the low information zone.
Yes.
And, when humans are armed with little data, we have to fill in the blanks. We have to try and connect the dots. And that's how we work. That's how humans work. And it's not wrong. It's not bad to point out that happens. Coming back to the videos, very briefly, the gimbal footage is another one of the more recent videos from 2014, 2015. That object is a very kind of amorphous. Some try to liken it to being a saucer in shape, and I think that appearance, or that interpretation of the appearance, was helped along by imagery produced by History Channel in support of the program called Unidentified: Inside America's UFO Investigation, which featured Luis Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, and others. The History Channel literally took an image of the gimbal footage and basically doctored in a flying saucer. They weren't trying to be deceptive. What they were trying to do was they were trying to use more obvious UFO imagery in the context of something that was recognizable from the recent 2017 articles and everything. But that certainly helped give the impression that what you see in that footage is a flying saucer. If you actually watch the video, it's just this sort of amorphous blob. But the pilots at one point, Samuel, start saying, look, it's rotating. Most analysts I've spoken with, they think that that's probably a mechanism on the camera itself. Yes. The aperture, or not the aperture, I'm sorry, but the actual lens is a rotational component on the lens that as it rotates, it seems to cause the rotation. Now, others would say, yeah, but the clouds aren't rotating. The only thing that seems to be rotating is that object. We have to take into consideration that if there is any kind of, it's presumably not a light source, a visual light source. I'm presuming that's an infrared detection. But if the object is producing infrared light, or there is some other aspect of the appearance of the object as that lens rotates, it could be a reflection off of that object, or it could be some other faculty of the camera system. But again, most analysts I've spoken with, they think that it's a rotation of the lens that accounts for the apparent movement of the object. Now, as to whether there's a real object or not, there was testimony provided by the weapons systems officer, which was released through FOIA and obtained by John Greenwald of the Black Vault, which does seem to strongly support that there was a real tangible object. The frustrating part about that is that those pilots had said, we weren't sure if this was a real object or not at first. We weren't sure if this wasn't part of a training operation and that we hadn't been clued in on it. They weren't sure, but they My understanding is I think that they did detect it on radar, but the testimony that was provided to congressional leaders about that and the portions, the excerpts of that interview that were released thereafter, they don't give us any clue as to what happened after the observation. Did the object leave the vicinity? Did they watch it speed off at a high rate of speed? Did they just lose the track and just say, okay, well, we don't know what it is, so we proceed on back, we're low on fuel? We don't know. So again, we don't really, I think, have enough information about that video to make conclusive determinations. I just say that I think that some of the phenomena we observe in the footage can be explained mechanically, not in terms of that object itself.
Is it correct to say that some of our more advanced aircraft, our American, I'm here in Italy, but let's say our advanced aircraft actually, through infrared viewing, actually do take on the basic shape of what we see in that video?
It's possible. The reason I
Well,
wouldn't
I've seen demonstrations of it. That's where I'm coming with it. So if you haven't, then that's fine. But
I have seen some of those, and my understanding would be that the heat signature that is a combination possibly of reflectivity off the surface of the aircraft itself in conjunction with the propulsion of the aircraft and the heat produced by the jet could actually present that sort of an amorphous appearance. Now, the thing about that is that presumably if that were a friendly, if that were an, for instance, a, FA-18 Super Hornet, I would imagine that they would not only be able to detect it on radar, but also that the identification friend or foe would also have registered friendly. Unless it's some sort of an anomalous aircraft or an aircraft that was operating without a transponder or that was, for whatever reason, not identifying itself as friendly. The fighter pilots in question should easily have been able to discern if that were one of the U.S. Fleet's aircraft. Now, what's interesting...
Fair enough.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, and this actually brings us over to the Tic Tac footage, the final video, which I think is the most anomalous of all the three. I put the go fast as in the probably solved case. I put the gimbal as, well, there are things about it that are probably misinterpretations, but we don't really know. But I will say this. If you go back through the Blue Book files, there are a lot of UAP that appeared to demonstrate identification friend or foe query responses in the affirmative. We are friendly. That was the case in an incident that occurred, I think, in March 1953 off the coast of, or rather off the Sea of Japan. There were a lot of them. I mean, there was one that was coinciding with the famous Lubbock Lights incident that Blue Book looked at. UAP, in other words, unidentified aircraft that responded as friendly when they were pinged by IFF systems. So that means one of two things to me. Either these are U.S. secret aircraft, or they are something more anomalous that's capable of decrypting our encrypted communication systems and spoofing us and representing themselves as friendlies. Now, one of those is far more speculative than the other. If I had to lean, if I had to lean on the side of skepticism, I would say that a lot of Blue Book reports involved unidentified aircraft that were probably U.S. special projects, which to date, if they remain off the books, this leaves open the possibility that there's an entire dimension of the history of U.S. military aircraft that seems to remain unaccounted for. That in itself is really interesting. But coming back to the Tic Tac, and I'll try to be brief about this, that's the most anomalous one. And in quick succession, I'll just say the reason why is because in addition to there being multiple witnesses to the primary object earlier that day, and also the radar detections of those for 2 weeks leading up to the incident, following Commander David Fravor's initial observation along with pilot Alex Dietrich, when the next fleet goes out, or the next squadron goes out, and Commander Lieutenant Chad Underwood at the time, the weapons systems officer, manages to detect that on the ATFLIR targeting pod. He tracks it and he films it, and we've seen this famous footage. Firstly, the object does appear to be consistent in shape, grainy though the video is. It seems to be consistent in general shape and appearance to what Fravor and others said they actually saw visually earlier that day. That's one point. Two, Commander Underwood has come forward, and in a pair of interviews, he's talked about what he actually saw. He said that when he observed that object and he was filming it, that it was actively trying to jam his radar at that time. So the skeptical argument that's been raised, mostly by Mick, again, I've never talked with Mick about that case, but I would like to. But Mick West has primarily said that it could be a distant 747. The reasons I would dispute that are, again, if it were a distant 747, I mean, I can look on Flight Radar 24 and I can know all the aircraft in the sky that have been
Yes.
operating within about a 5-minute window
Yes.
that are conventional aircraft, right? Because they have transponders. That object appeared not to have a transponder. So some have said, well, it could have been a drug runner, right? It could have been somebody, who was carrying illicit, cargo down to Mexico or bringing it up to the United States. Well, those kind of aircraft generally don't use active radar jamming capabilities against military fighter pilots.
Right.
The other issue there is that if we don't have a transponder, but we do have an aircraft that doesn't seem to be producing any kind of visible propulsion, which would easily have been detectable through the infrared, if only barring the possibility that it was a distant aircraft, and therefore we see again a diffused blob rather than a distinctive aircraft. Nonetheless, I think that we would probably have radar, or we would have transponder information that would seem to be consistent with a distant aircraft. So, and then further, I think even McWest has conceded that rather than being a great distance away, it was probably closer, somewhere in the distance, probably of maybe 19 miles. But keep in mind that the ATFLIR has, I think, a 40 nautical mile range.
Yes.
So again, we have to assume that the object at least is within that distance. So I conclude, based on the information that we have, that we had an object that was far closer than initial estimates, skeptical conclusions had assessed. The object appears consistent with the shape of what others described seeing that day. It doesn't appear to show any kind of visible exhaust or propulsion means. The object also, if we take Chad Underwood's word, appeared to be jamming his radar. It was also passing through controlled military airspace, and thereby it was effectively a range fouler, as the military calls it. Naval officers use this term for objects that interrupt planned training exercises. It did all of these things, and Underwood says that that constitutes an act of war. So I think we're dealing with, whatever it was, an object that is far more difficult to rule out as possibly anomalous. And it seemed consistent with the descriptions that the pilots who observed it actually gave. That one, I can't so easily say that was something about the camera or that was parallax effect. That one, the so-called Tic Tac, remains the most unusual video of them all to me.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. Maybe you have a little bit of camera experience as well. But I would ask you though, are you making a leap though when you say, right, or what you're reporting here, right, from the pilot, that the object, right, that was seen was blocking or interfering with signals?
That is what
Couldn't that blocking or interference come from elsewhere?
It's possible. I've actually spoken with a colleague about that. Now, first, what Commander Underwood said was that he said that it appeared to be jamming his capabilities to attempt to detect this thing on radar. He says that as he was trying to get a lock on this, it was actively jamming. That's what Commander Underwood said. I spoke recently with an analyst who's a member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, which I'm a member of that organization as well, even though I don't have a PhD. But my interest in this topic and the way I try to relate to it apparently was enough to warrant inclusion in the organization. So they were kind of.
By the way, who are some of the others on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of different people who are members. Founding board members are, of course, Robert Powell, who is a former director of investigations with MUFON, but Robert Powell, of course, Rich Hoffman, Jordan Bell. There are a lot of others too. Larry Hancock, Peter Reilly was one of the team members that I recently spoke with, who was one of the ones who contributed to an analysis, along with Robert Powell and others, of the Tic Tac incident that SCU produced. Long story short, SCU kind of was born out of members of other groups who were a little dissatisfied with the level of scientific interest and application to the UAP issue, and they decided to try and form a more scientifically literate and scientifically oriented research group that would look at these aerospace phenomena. So long story short, I spoke with Peter Reilly recently, and that was one thing that he'd speculated about. He said, I wondered if there wouldn't be some other aspect of the object that might have the effect of blocking radar without there being an intentional attempt at jamming, right?
Right.
So it could be presumption on my part. I'm going with what Commander Fravor has described.
Yeah, you're just reporting. Yes.
I'm reporting what he describes, but we should be
Mhm,
very careful to draw a distinction
mhm,
between reporting what he describes and saying that we know for a fact that radar jamming was being used by that object or aircraft.
mhm.
Because even some of my colleagues have suspected that there might be other means by which that apparent effect could be achieved.
Yes.
One, and I'm no expert in this, but my understanding based on what Really was telling me was that, again, could plasmas on the exterior of an object somehow also have that effect, or at very least make it difficult to discern what an object is using radar.
Mhm,
Now,
mhm.
of course, going all the way back to Project Blue Book, some of the official explanations that were offered for UAP observed at Minot Air Force Base in the late 1960s were, you guessed it, ball lightning,
That's
which
right. Mhm, mhm.
yeah, they had essentially tried to say that there was no UFO, it was ball lightning, and that's what was detected on radar, probably photographed on radar scope as well. So it would be difficult maybe to conclude that in instances where it's convenient to say there was no UFO, that it was ball lightning detected on radar, but then that UFOs also are undetectable on radar because of plasma. Again, this is where we kind of fall into that low information zone. I mean,
Mhm,
think
mhm.
for a moment how little we actually know about natural plasmas, right? So, and that's why I'm hesitant to try and lead the discussion with that as an explanatory mechanism for UAP. But it is a relevant tangent area of interest that should be further understood, better understood,
I agree
right?
as far as natural plasma, but when we get into the field of plasma technology, which a lot of it is really classified,
Hmm.
then this is an entirely different matter because these plasmas can actually produce a radar trace, right?
Right.
And so you're seeing it on the radar screen, right? And
Mhm.
yet it's not a physical object, but one could interpret it as such. And I would argue that, right, we could have scenarios where there are actual tests being run, right?
Oh,
And
for sure.
meant to deceive, right, in order to test. How not only testing to see how friendly, that is, let's say, American forces, are going to react, in uncertain circumstances. But also, this would give, the military and intelligence communities, right, a clue as to how, enemy uh, air fighters might react to these types of, plasma
Oh,
uh,
absolutely.
creations, right? And I think that's something we have to. I think is valuable to keep in mind is that um, what why did the Pentagon come out? Why is this such an area of discourse since 2017? And it's, could it be related to, the decades and decades and decades, right? The whole heritage of, the Cold War
Mhm.
and all the lessons, military lessons that were learned from that. And now, right, with the world situation the way it is now, right, one can see, the usefulness of these types of tests, right, or whatever we want to call them, yeah, even more, right?
Mhm.
For instance, all right. So, what if someone wanted to use a plasma technology that's able to produce an image which seems to defy the laws of physics, right? How would that play out, in a real war, for
Oh, yeah.
instance?
I mentioned Mark Pilkington, and he wrote an excellent book that people should read called Mirage Men. And it looks at not just what was happening during the 1980s and some of the
Mhm,
disinformation that was purportedly being undertaken by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and how that related to the UFO community and the dynamics at that time.
mhm,
It
mhm,
also goes back much earlier and looks at the history of the development of electronic countermeasures, some of the plasma type technologies that we're discussing here. Pilkington speculates about some of the famous sightings of UAP over the Washington area in 1952, and the notion that that might be potentially explained by such technologies. Again, for years we've been able to spoof objects,
mhm.
on radar.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of ways that that can be done. And if you could combine that kind of radar anomaly with a light in the sky, you could make a very convincing UFO that would fool pilots, that would fool radar operators, air traffic controllers, and certainly ground-based observers. I have no doubt that the technology exists to be able to do that. I further don't doubt that it may even be possible for those kind of objects to be detectable and
They are.
perceived. Yeah, and detectable and perceived as physical, tangible objects, even by some of the advanced capabilities that the naval fleet currently has in use. Is that the explanation for some of these UAP? It could
Could
be.
be.
Could be. But again, that's the speculation because, yet again, we don't have a full data set to draw those conclusions. Although some would argue, in fairness, that if those conclusions, if we can create a how do I want to term this? If we could create a convincing argument based on the existence of known or suspected technologies that could account for all the different things that are observed, we should lead with the presumption, therefore, that that's the most probable explanation.
Sure.
But again, for me, being an agnostic and being someone who, if I don't have firm data, that I won't draw a conclusion. That's the tricky part about the UAP thing, is because to me there are enough cases well outside a lot of the military stuff. And I'll mention, by the way, that during a discussion I had earlier, well, actually last year, with Jacques Vallée, Jacques had said that the military cases constitute, I think, less than maybe, I think the figure he gave me was like 5 to 10% of all the data that he was amassing for a particular database that he actually constructed in support of one of those programs we mentioned, ALSAP. And he speaks very publicly and frankly about this now. And he said, those military cases are just a sliver of all the data. When we look at the rest of that data, to me, even if we were to presume that a lot of it were misperceptions, some of them were hoaxes, some of these were imaginative, experiences that people had, and maybe there was
Or honest misinterpretations.
right, any number of things. Even if we say that a very, very small, portion of the broader UAP data set does represent good observations of tangible objects, that to me points to things that are far outside the scope of known technologies. But nonetheless, I still think we can definitely explain a lot of these things through the kind of mechanisms we're discussing, and they're known to exist and have existed for decades.
And I would hasten to add that even though the military cases are just a sliver, right, statistically speaking, at the same time, though, there must be a huge chunk, right, of UAP sightings, not by military people, but right, somehow involved with or in proximity to, right, military installations. For instance, if someone sees a UAP or a UFO in California, I mean, there are military bases all around. So, right, it could be very possibly related, to the military, even though the person witnessing it, right, is not a member, right, of the military. But another thing that I'm very suspicious about here, right? I heard Eric Weinstein. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but
Sure.
recently I heard Eric Weinstein mention that he would not name the names, understandably, but he's been told, yeah, I have people inside the government, right, promising me, to show me clearer footage than, the Tic Tac and the Gumball and all this, clearer footage. And the promises never seem to be realized, but those promises are there. But for me, all sorts of flags go up there because, right, if you go back several decades, that's exactly that's how Hynek, right, was being played. People inside the intelligence were telling him, "Hey, we're going to come out, and we've got the craft, everything. We're going to come out and finally reveal it." Right. And so Hynek was all excited. Of course, it never came to anything, but apart from a sort of a disinformation documentary called "It Has Begun: UFOs," which was narrated by the great Rod Serling.
Yeah.
And which just disinformation and mythology that was promoted by that, but is being promoted by the Air Force, right? And so it seems the same thing is just repeating itself. And I think you and I actually know the name or names of some of these people that are leading Weinstein on, actually.
I would suspect we do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I do, and I know you have basically the same connections. So it's very suspicious to me. Uh, I can't help but go there, right?
No, I don't
Back.
think that's not unwarranted in this instance, given the historical, the historical relationship between intelligence agencies. And I believe it was Vallée that first termed this the dangling carrot phenomena, which I like that name for it,
Mhm.
where UFO researchers are promised, again, for a brief background, anyone who may not be familiar with this, the film that you just mentioned,
Right, he's
UFO.
a colleague with Hynek.
Yeah. The filmmaker, I guess, who had authored a book, Robert Emenegger,
Yes,
he was told, we've got footage of a landing that occurred at Holloman Air Force Base, and we think we can get this for you guys for this documentary. And they were kind of led on, and this was basically the whole premise that upon which the documentary is made.
yes.
And at the last minute, they're told, well, we can't actually release this footage, but what you
Mhm.
guys could do is
Right.
you could produce some drawings, and you could present it as a what if scenario. There are a few things that really, I mean, real flags that were raised about that whole thing to me. And keep in mind that in Emenegger's book, there's a short, like maybe 2 or 3 page chapter
That's
that
right.
outlines this, and then it's dramatized at the end of the film in like paintings, kind of watercolor images. But the so-called extraterrestrials that touch down at Holloman, they have kind of bluish gray skin and big noses. And immediately what comes to mind for me is I'm thinking this is exactly how Betty Hill described uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
her dreams about she and her husband Barney's alleged experience from New Hampshire back in the early 60s that had been published only a few years before Emenegger's book and the documentary in John G. Fuller's The Interrupted Journey. I mean, it's almost obvious where that description
Right.
comes from, which again, we have to also point out that that's how Betty described them in her dreams. But under hypnosis, she was fairly vague about how she said the beings looked. And then Barney Hill, he kind of changes completely from where I mean, it's important to point out he did say that he saw beings on board a craft in his waking memory, and he had described that to an ICAP investigator, Walter Webb, prior to undergoing hypnosis.
Hmm.
That's a
Hmm.
little outside the scope of this conversation, but I
Right.
bring that up because I want to say that there is what Barney Hill said he saw and remembered and reported to Walter Webb. There is what Betty thereafter said that she was recalling from dreams, and then there is what they both claim that they observed under hypnosis. Between the two of them, and amidst those three different portions of alleged memory, I mean, there's very little continuity. There are glaring discrepancies, in fact.
Right. And Barney described them as basically humans in Nazis uniforms. Right.
Initially did, yeah, and then under
Yeah.
hypnosis said that they again were just kind of, bald and kind of had grayish skin, but that didn't jibe with the description that was given by Betty from her dreams. So again, we have actually three different descriptions of what the beings look like. Nonetheless, the fact that there's such similarity between what was told to Emenegger and what Betty gave a very vivid description of in the back of Fuller's book, according to her dream diary, I mean, it's pretty clear that's where the source was. Now,
Yeah.
Richard Doty, of course, when he comes out years later and admits, if
Hmm.
that's to be believed, there's a lot of questions about that. But Rick
Hmm.
Doty, of course, had been a Air Force Office of Special Investigations special agent at Kirtland Air Force Base, who was tasked with presenting bad information not only to a researcher named Paul Benowitz, but to several others, Linda Moulton Howe. He had also had interactions with the co-author of the book, The Roswell Incident, with Charles Berlitz, Bill Moore.
Hmm.
So numerous individuals had interactions with Doty, but Doty even later came out and said that the Holloman incident never happened. That was part of the disinformation, that there had been an incident, but it occurred like at, I think, White Sands, and it was much earlier, and it didn't involve anything like what appeared in the film. But again, the question always with Doty is, where does the disinformation end and the truth begin, or is there
Right,
any?
right. This is it's yeah, outside the realm of science, but
Yeah.
it's yeah, it seems to me that the whole what the American government created was a whole mythology,
Oh yeah.
right, in the service of anti-Soviet propaganda, right. So it's part of the Cold War strategy. And now one may say, well, the Cold War's over now. Yes, but right, our America's relations, with Russia are certainly strained, and China as well.
Say the
So
least.
some of the same needs are still in place. right?
Mhm.
So planting the seeds of, oh wow, could it be that America does have extraterrestrial technology that they're trying to figure out, back engineer, right? And all of this, seems to me a plausible explanation that also the other side would be engaging in as well, right?
Oh,
To,
for
to
certain.
keep the other side guessing, right? Now, I'm not saying that would explain all the motivations, right, and all behind UAP experiences, but I think historically viewed that was a part of it.
Well, some UAP experiences, the very few that seem to represent valid observations of very unusual things and people's experiences with seemingly extraordinary phenomena. I would imagine those are in the distinctive minority in the broad, collection of what we look at historically in term UAP. But even some of those experiences, real or imagined, very well may have, and in my view, likely have informed efforts by the U.S. military to
Hmm.
present a body of information, which effectively, I think you used the right term, they are effectively a mythology. And
Hmm.
that mythology has been very useful in obfuscating a number of things. It confuses the enemy. It
Yes.
confuses the American populace enough so as to provide kind of a shield, a cover for various secret technologies that have been in development. And this is speculative, but I think it's worthwhile to mention. Like you, like everybody who's ever looked at this, I've often pondered over, for instance, the stories told by Robert Lazar, Bob Lazar,
All
the
right.
alleged employee at S4.
Right. Right.
Early on, I think I'd been like, oh, this guy really sounds credible. His story's never changed. I'm more skeptical, very much more skeptical about it now. But the question to me does still remain to some extent. Most would just presume, well, it's obviously it's nonsense. These are just lies. I often wonder, and I never want to accuse somebody of being a liar if I
Right.
can't
Right. Right.
prove that. But I have wondered, and I'll just put it this way: wouldn't it be convenient for a person like Bob to tell those stories? Maybe even if he believed them, let's say it's not true, but he actually believes that it all happened, and he's even alluded maybe to that himself. And I've heard others allude to the idea that Lazar might have been misled in some
Hmm.
way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if that had happened, wouldn't that be convenient in the furtherance of that mythology? Right?
Hmm.
Wouldn't that be
Hmm.
useful?
Hmm.
It certainly would be.
Hmm. Yeah. Certainly. Well, anyway, yeah. Uh, let's switch gears here.
Let's climb out of the rabbit
Um,
hole.
yeah. Yeah. There is Charlie Lineweaver, is an anthropologist. I've mentioned him to you before. He's pointed out that, right, on six land masses, right, of our Earth, on six land masses, and that includes Australia. Those include Australia, right? That were isolated, right, geographically from the trajectory, right, that produced Homo sapiens sapiens, right. On none of those land masses did anything like human intelligence independently evolve, right? So what's my point there? My point, all right, so I'm switching gears here, and all right, so a lot of people, as you know, um, jump from UFO to extraterrestrial, right? And um, there seems to be two main camps. There's a third camp to which I belong, actually, but two camps out there. One camp would be like the rare earth camp, at least those within it who would say, yeah, we're probably the only intelligence in the galaxy, or maybe even in the whole universe. Yeah, we're it, right? Then the other camp is they like the verb teeming, right? The cosmos, the universe is teeming with intelligence, right?
Certainly.
All right, so but there's another camp to which I belong, and that is we don't know. Right. All right. So we just don't know. We can talk about probabilities, but we really don't know. And so I refuse to say, oh, I believe we're the only intelligence in the universe, just as forcefully as I refuse to say, oh, yeah, the universe must be teeming with intelligence. Just look how big the universe is, right? Which is really, it's not a scientific argument. It's not sound. It's not a sound argument because we know how big, well, the observable universe is, right? And right, so everything depends on numbers here, statistics and chance. We don't know, right, how probable it is, right, that life could get started, right? And so very, very quickly, right, when we're dealing with, exponential numbers, very, very quickly, you can go from, you can be presented with the possibility that even as vast as the observable universe is, right, if the chances for life, right, getting started, right, are at a certain, low percentage. I mean, things even out, and there's nothing surprising about it at all. We could have, a 90 billion light year observable universe, and then statistically, it's possible, right? Maybe it's possible that it's probable that there's only intelligence, scattered here and there, that is very rare, right? But again, it's possible. We don't know. Right now, we do know that once life did get started on this planet, right, it can repeat and replay itself over and over. But right, that's not to be confused with that original first step of life emerging. So that we don't know what the statistics involved with that are, right? And so. And again, all right, so go back to Charlie Lineweaver, right? So we got 6 land masses, right, that were separated from, right, the area where where we saw Homo sapiens sapiens emerge, and on none of those did anything like human intelligence independently evolve, right? And so that's one of the points to keep in mind, right, on the side of the camp that may suspect, yeah, well, intelligence could be rare, right? Indeed, on this planet, so it's like 6 out of 7 chances, right? It only happened once, right? And so, that's also points out another important point is that our anthropomorphic perspective. So many people tend to think that Homo sapiens, right, are the apex, of God's creation or of the evolutionary process, right? Which is really, I think, arrogant, as if evolution naturally tends to what you and I are as far as intelligence in a species go. Well, no, 6 out of 7 chances it didn't take on, only on the one, right? The trajectory that comes out of Africa, right? And so that's one possibility, right? And the other issue is then the famous Fermi paradox, right? And so there are, as you know, there are a lot who envision things like von Neumann probes and things like this. So if it's sort of a conundrum, a paradox, a mystery, right? If there is abundant life in the universe, why don't we see evidence, of AI and things like that, and Dyson spheres and all of this? So that's the reason I'm mentioning these points is to say that it is plausible, right? Not to dogmatically insist, but right to speak in terms of probability, that it is not irrational, right, to say that, well, intelligence may be very rare. And so when we're faced with something like UAP or UFO, we should not jump to conclusions, right? Right. It's a leap in logic, I think, right, to go from UFOs to extraterrestrial intelligence, right? And but anyway, you have any reactions to all that? As if it seemed like I'm just rambling there, but
No, I certainly do. And one thing I always appreciate about our conversations is I start having to take notes, so I can leave some breadcrumbs for myself to make sure I cover all the areas I
my
want to respond to.
apologies.
No. I appreciate that about you. And of course, you and I have had long conversations about these kind of topics before. First, to the point about the rareness of intelligent life forms as we know it here on Earth, which we would recognize ourselves, unfortunately, as being the apex of, although we should make the distinction between what we recognize as the obvious earthly apex of intelligence that humans appear to represent versus the conception that there couldn't be any kind of other, or that we are the top of the food chain universally, or maybe even in terms of Earth. There's that unique hypothesis, the so-called Silurian hypothesis, which I enjoy because, of course, it's a reference to Doctor Who, which again, is borrowing from classic sci-fi. But the premise is essentially this: how do we know that humans are the only representation of intelligent life, bipedal or otherwise, that's ever come to fruition on Earth? And if there had been at an earlier stage in the development of our planet, considering the billions of years that Earth has existed, considering the range of life forms that have come to exist here, considering the rarity of fossil preservation of life forms, and our expectation that we can account for all life forms throughout the history of Earth based on only what we find in the fossil record. Also, taking into consideration how likely it would be that evidence of technologies after a long enough period would effectively be erased. Hypothesis here is, could there have been another advanced civilization that ever existed on Earth? And if so, would we be able to recognize evidence of them if it had happened long ago? Long enough, in fact, that all that evidence is lost. It's not impossible that there might have been more intelligent life forms that have come and gone on Earth. And that's not even leaving our little mud ball here, but to presume, if we extend that to other regions of the universe, or even just the Milky Way, if we were to presume that the periodicity of life coming to fruition and then, perhaps cataclysmic events occurring, or, mutually assured self-destruction by, warring civilizations on an existing planet, the rise and fall of civilizations coming into the equation. I mean, how likely is it that there have been intelligent life forms throughout the universe? I mean, probable, I would say. If it happened on Earth, it certainly must have been the case that there would be other conditions conducive to the formation of life elsewhere in the universe. But they may have risen and fallen, and that may have happened, untold numbers of times prior to us coming to the point where, with SETI or any other kind of capabilities, we might find them and be able to detect them. So the question right now to me isn't so much one of, are we alone in the universe? It's whether or not our neighbors are still alive, and whether we will last long enough to find the next kid on the block that may be out there, but they haven't quite reached the point where they're producing enough, carbon emissions or something, and there's some sort of detectable techno signature that we'll be able to resolve as being evidence of an intelligent civilization. I also wonder, and this is highly speculative, there's no evidence of it, but I also wonder if we take, and I always like this term, there was a great researcher by the name of Mac Tonnies who years ago had written a very brief essay, and tragically it wasn't even completed at the time of his death, but he the manuscript was saved and was published in incomplete form, and it was titled The Cryptoterrestrials. It was just a thought experiment, is what Mac was presenting, but the general premise had been, what if there could be an indigenous form of intelligence on Earth that somehow is unrecognized by us? What are the ways by which that could happen? Is it possible that there could be some kind of an indigenous non-human intelligence that somehow is very difficult to distinguish from human intelligence? Is that possible? Most scientists would say that's impossible. Here's a question, a very relevant one too. If it seems that some UAP represents something that is far beyond our known capabilities, what seems less likely? Some kind of technology from here on Earth, or alien visitation, considering the paucity of information that supports the existence of intelligent extraterrestrials? Our study programs have been woefully incapable. I don't want to say they're incapable, but they have been very unsuccessful in detecting evidence. And that to me doesn't so much point out necessarily the shortcomings of SETI as it does the lack of data out there that strongly represents intelligent life. So, if it's not out there and we haven't detected it, why is it that we would have it in our backyard? Right, and be ignorant to that, which is a possibility. So I asked these questions. Is life throughout the universe actually, at least in terms of the periods during which they occupy regions of the universe at the same time, and thereby might be detectable to one another, with the comings and goings of civilizations? Are we faced with the possibility that intelligent life really is a whole lot less common. And if that's the case, how do we account for these phenomena? Now, another one that, of course, my colleague, Dr. Michael Masters and others have proposed involves whether or not time travel could be involved. Again, this is speculative.
Sure.
But it's an interesting question in terms of how can we account for a terrestrial phenomena that, rather than extraterrestrial, but one that doesn't seem to fit into the current time, temporal framework of what we're dealing with right now with UAP. I'm an agnostic. I am open to all possibilities. I assign certain levels of likelihood to some greater than others, but I'm agnostic and beholden to none of them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's all pretty wild, and as far as the human observation goes of odd things in the sky, I think often there's a combination of reality and imagination. For instance, something I saw with about a dozen other people in my youth, right? Just being situated a few miles from Skunk Works, right? One night. We saw a very strange object. I mean, overhead, basically. We're on top of a building, actually, with a telescope. And then before we know it, two what would probably have been F-16s, we watched them take off from Skunk Works and try to intercept this object. The object, the flick of a finger, just a split second, right, was clear across the valley, right? And of course, one would hasten to add, well, yeah, we don't have any technology that can do that, right? And a human being inside an object like that would have been killed, right? But the thing about it is, right, when I'll never forget seeing it, this object seemed to be composed of two parts, which were flowing into each other, right? And so, but now, all right, so there are two possibilities there, right? So, right, all right, so, well, could be more, but it could be that, all right, so, well, maybe this is some strange object, this hyperdimensional, right? And so different aspects of it can pass through each other, right? Or another one could be that, well, it's just an effect of light. And, as we know, right, because of the structure of the human eye, for instance, it's difficult for humans to swat a fly, right? And we have the illusion that we can watch a fly fly, across our field of vision, where we're actually only seeing segments of it, and our brain is giving us the illusion of a continuous movement.
Yes.
Right, and so so what I saw that night, it could have been an optical illusion, right? That something was passing physically into. The third possibility, of course, right? This is near Skunk Works, right? So this could have been some kind of plasma experiment. And so it, wasn't physical in that sense, of metal or anything like that. And so it was just some kind of image being produced, which would explain why it could shoot across the entire valley in a split second. Right. And then it came back, actually. I don't want to go into the story. And, the F-16 sort of gave up, or at least, that's one way of viewing it. They gave up trying to intercept it. And the whole thing could have been a test of the F-16 pilots, right? So we don't know.
Could have been a show where the F-16s knew what they were chasing, but the public was, presented this to give the impression that, oh gosh, there's something up there that these fighter jets are chasing. Who knows?
Hell of a show for me, that for everyone else that night on top of the building. I've often wondered, what the hell are these things, right? Because when you grow up out there seeing these things, so that's you wonder, and but. I've sort of resigned myself. Well, I'm never going to know. I don't have access to channels that maybe do know, or maybe no one knows. I don't claim to know, but I do think that the plasma possibility, for instance, is more probable, right, than saying, well, yeah, I saw something from Alpha Centauri or, some other planetary system. is more, I don't know, but one is more probable than the other.
Oh, certainly. Well, that's what's frustrating, because I have to basically come to the same conclusion you do, Samuel. That the most probable answer is the one that I'm going to say that seems most likely to me. I think the only thing that differentiates me and why I don't call myself I mean, I am skeptical, but I don't have a badge, and I have a card that I pull out of my wallet and say, see, I'm a member of this skeptical organization. I don't
Right.
self-identify as a skeptic in the social sense of going to skeptic events and representing myself as that. And I'll tell you why. There's one simple reason. And by the way, people have asked me over the years, they say, we see that you go and you speak at conferences that are kind of geared toward the UAP subject. Do you go to skeptical conferences too? Do you go and represent yourself at those? And I often say, well, no, and I don't, because of one simple fundamental reason. Often when I'm at UFO conferences, I am hired to come and speak, and I often speak skeptically about the subject when I'm at those events. So much so that I've angered some of the participants in the past. But as is the agreement between the event producers and in my role as a person who researches and discusses this subject, they often invite me. They may cover my travel. And so it's facilitated for me to be at those events. I've never been invited to attend a skeptical event and to present at a skeptical event. If I were invited, I probably would. And if there were ever one that were near enough to me that I could go to, that I had easy access to, it wouldn't cost me hundreds and hundreds of dollars, to line up travel, lodging and all this, plus the fee of entering the event. I'd love to do that. I'd love to attend one. Now, that said, I don't self-identify, though, as a skeptic for one simple reason, because often I do see more skeptically inclined people who do identify in that way. Due to that self-identification, they predictably always come to a skeptical conclusion about all phenomena they observe. They don't all do that. There's some really good skeptics out there who are very good at saying, I don't know, when they don't have a complete data set. But I've for years known many who and a great example of this, I think, historically, I should mention his name just because he's probably historically the best example, Philip J. Klass. He, I think, got into kind of a habit with his writing. I've gone and I've read a lot of Klass's works over the years, but I was disappointed to find that as time went on, he seemed to have convinced himself that because he could present a explanation for UAP or anything else, it was the explanation. And he loved to kind of tout himself as being the guy who had the explanation. I've solved the whole UAP mystery, back when they were called UFOs. But I mean, to me, because you can present a explanation doesn't mean that you've solved the case. Often the explanations he presented strained credulity far worse than even some.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so that was the issue. And I don't self-identify for fear of leading with a kind of what I might fail to recognize as illogic. And I do think that some have done that. It's okay to say I don't know sometimes, but we have to, and back to the point about plasmas or any of the other kind of proposed explanations we look at, although I don't self-identify and challenge myself to come up with an explanation and then buy my own hype and convince myself I've solved the whole mystery, I acknowledge the more likely explanations for a lot of these things. And you have to be practically minded when it comes to this. So again, those kinds of things to me are the first potential explanations we should look at, whether or not we lead with a presumption that that's what UAP are. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say I'm in the camp, the camp I mentioned earlier. The camp I'm in is the same one, that someone like Professor David Kipping would belong to. He's with the Cool Worlds Lab, right? So just Google it.
Yeah.
He points out the problems with the rare earth, and with the cosmos teeming with life camps. Because we simply don't know. We don't have the data in, right? So the scientific way to treat this is to be agnostic, right? And that's not as exciting, right? As taking sides, right? And both of those sides can become emotionally charged and can have their own types of dogmas, right? Even unconsciously, right? Just devolve into wishful thinking as well on either side. Well, you were the only intelligence, and so
Well,
But another point too is like, the Copernican principle, right?
yes.
So this is often, well, the universe must be teeming with life. We can't be the only intelligence because of the Copernican principle, right? So we can't be special. But I've always had a problem with that, and it's this. There's a certain validity to it. Yeah, there's a valid point to that, but it also overlooks something, and that is that every observer is special. All right, so think of the moment that we live in, right? In the history of the species, Homo sapiens sapiens. It's damn privileged, very interesting. As far as we can see, quite the most interesting, right? Just we're at this, possibility of emerging into AI, real AI.
Yeah.
Um, and so what's the likelihood that we would have been born? What's the likelihood that, someone is born, in a particular country, right? Where life is much better than on most of the other planet. Well, it's just an illusion of perspective. You know, every perspective, every point of view can be special, right? And so anyway, so I think we have to accept the Copernican principle. Yeah, it's valid. Yeah, we're not all that special, but at the same time, yeah, well, in some ways, we are special.
Yeah. To that point, really quickly, uh, back, in several centuries ago, we go back and we look
Mm,
at, for instance, the primarily theologically informed perspective of, the divinity of humans by virtue of being creations of God and thereby our place in the center of the universe. There's a
mm,
very different discussion, when it comes to recognizing that and the fallacy and that kind of thinking,
mhm,
as
mhm.
opposed to uh, the Copernican view that, well, we're not at the center of the universe and thereby we're not really all that intelligent, but or rather special, but
Special.
thereby in likelihood we aren't the only ones. If there were good data, that's the whole thing. The scientific search for other intelligences doesn't necessarily have to presume that, well, we're not important, and in a Copernican,
That's
universal
right.
kind of
I
view, they're likely to be out there. I mean, I think a lot of people would hold that view, and I do, but I also recognize that given our current attempts to try and locate evidence to support the view that there are others out there like us who are equally unimportant and therefore they're probably there, we
mm,
haven't found them. So, scientifically, we may have to resolve that life is fairly special and that that is an incredible thing without us having to be at the center of the universe, right? The focal point. But humans
that's
always
right.
place ourselves
And
in.
yeah, anthropomorphism
Yeah.
comes to haunt us again because, right, well, yeah, tell us,
Well,
how are we trying to find this extraterrestrial intelligence? What, radio waves?
yeah. Well, think
All
about
right,
this too.
how
We
biased is that?
Oh, yeah. Well, and the other thing too is that in terms of the anthropomorphism, humans
Mhm,
always place ourselves at the center. And another great example is the UAP thing. Well,
mhm,
let's presume that these are exotic and that their intelligences, what are they doing? Well, they're surveying, they're studying us, they're watching us. They're trying to turn
mhm,
off our nuclear weapons sites and things and disable our weapons and let us know we're watching you. And they're abducting
and
our people and they're trying to create hybrids because of all the places in the universe that they could go to.
mhm,
They got to come to Earth and they got to take genetic samples of humans and create hybrids with us. Again, you look at a lot of the data.
mhm,
Actually, I hesitate to call that data, but let's call it a lot of the information that has helped build the UFO myth over the last several centuries in popular literature
mhm,
related to this
mhm,
subject.
mhm, mhm.
The anthropomorphic element there, where humans place ourselves at the center of it. We are the main crux of it all, the linchpin of whatever the alien agenda is. I
Yeah,
mean, I suspect strongly that most of that's nonsense, and it stems from that old time-honored tradition of
yeah.
people
It
putting
seems,
ourselves at the
it
center of the narrative.
seems, yeah, it seems we're defining intelligence, but by technology,
Yeah,
processing technology.
and human
So,
technology too.
well, that's what I mean by human technology. We're defining intelligence by human technology, uh,
Yeah,
right? So, but take a larger step back and be more humble, and then consider whales, dolphins, for instance, who may very well be quite intelligent, but they've evolved in a different way, and so right, they don't make radios, and they don't make atom bombs and hydrogen bombs, and so right, who is more advanced? right? You could look at it from an ethical and moral perspective, right? And then the whales and dolphins are probably, ahead of us, right? But it's like Carl Sagan wrote once. Well, maybe the whales are telling stories, right? When we hear their sounds, maybe they're telling stories. So maybe they are intelligent, and we think we're intelligent. So we're looking for intelligence out in the universe, which we're assuming must be like human intelligence. Well, why not, try to find whales, in some other planetary system, or dolphins, or, something like that. And another example, right, which we discussed before, is the novel and then the film adaptations of Solaris.
Oh yeah.
Right, right. And so there you have a sentient ocean on this extraterrestrial planet, trying to communicate with these humans, right, on an orbiting spacecraft. And, so that,
Doing very bizarre things too in its
yeah,
attempts to communicate.
yeah,
At
so
least to us.
communicating through their dreams, basically,
Mm.
and through the dreams then creates these material instantiations of people who have died, right, that the dreamers had known. But my point here is, all right, so, what if some ocean on some far distant planet in some far distant planet, a solar system, is sentient, as in that movie, and we observe it and we just say, oh, nothing there because there's no radio waves, right? So would we even know an extraterrestrial intelligence if we encountered it, if it were staring at us, in the face, right? And then, as I said in the introduction, and if we were, would we even be able to communicate with it?
Right.
And, because what we're going to assume that maybe we can communicate with an extraterrestrial intelligence through mathematics, for instance. Carl Sagan invoked that possibility many times. But but again, I think that's human anthropomorphism and hubris. So if it's a sentient ocean, right? And why would that be impossible? Why would that be improbable? We have no idea how complex chemically and biological some extraplanetary ocean could be, right? And it could be some living organism, and we not recognize it if we're not looking for it and looking.
Oh yeah. I imagine the Solarian ocean. We finally get there and we ask it. We find a way to communicate and we ask it, why didn't you build transmitters? Why didn't you alert us to your intelligence and your presence? Why didn't you use radio signals? And it kind of laughs and says, why do I need radios?
Yeah, why didn't you build atom bombs?
Really great idea.
Yeah, well, I always like to try to inject some ethics and morality, into discussions like this, because, when we look at our species in that light, then, I think we gain a little bit more humility, and we realize, well, maybe we're not the top of the chain in every sense.
True.
Anyways, it's been utterly fascinating. Of course, we haven't answered any questions because we simply don't know. But right, it's I think that it's useful to talk about these subjects because they're so much of part of the public discourse in the last couple of years, and people are rightfully interested in what's going on, what might be going on. But I hate to tell everyone we don't know. I don't know. Micah doesn't know. Probably no one knows. Anyway, you have any closing thoughts, Micah?
I do, and I don't know what necessarily the origin of this statement was. I seem to recall I did at one point, but I'm familiar with it from, again, the work of my colleague Greg Bishop, who I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
The hell with the answer. What was the question? And sometimes if you don't have answers, the questions are an important thing to focus on, which I think we've done a little bit today, and it's always a pleasure to do that with you.
Yeah, that was my philosophy 101 professor. That was a lesson that he taught, an idea that he taught that I never forgot, and that is right. Most of the time, it's more important to find the correct questions than answers. And in this case, I personally, as you know, right, I have a lot of contacts in the intelligence community and DARPA, and from what I know, right, behind the scenes, I never encountered the slightest evidence for any kind of extraterrestrial presence on planet Earth.
Mhm.
Right. But I mean, there are people in the intelligence community who feel differently, but at least the ones I've, circulated with, there's no one has been aware of anything, and there's just no evidence to convince us. But it doesn't mean we know that there isn't, some kind
Sure.
of extraterrestrial intelligence. But I mean, as scientific thinkers or scholars, we don't see any, not only any proof, we don't see any evidence for it, right, that would lead us there, right? And in fact, there are some uh, behind the scenes, right, who've expressed to me that, yeah, we think it's, that we is just, individuals, right?
Mhm.
And there are a lot of different opinions in these classified groups, right? But some of them have expressed to me, so yeah, we think it's more probable that these would be human time travelers rather than extraterrestrial visitors, right? Because of just the high probability, they think, of rarity of intelligence in the universe. All right, but I've never heard anyone even there claim to know. It's just suspicions, right, and levels of probability. And because many people would have the exact opposite. It's like, well, yeah, extraterrestrial visitation is always more probable than time travel, right? Given
Right.
what seem insuperable challenges to time travel, at least from the perspective of modern theoretical physics. But in any case, yeah, I don't know, but I don't think we're being visited by extraterrestrials in metal spaceships from other solar systems. But what do I know?
Well, what do any of us know? It's a fascinating subject, and it perplexes me. I always say on any good day of the week, I'll wake up and say, there is a phenomenon here. Then the other days of the week, I kind of look at it and go, there's a strange intersection between mythology and human perception, and maybe some physical, tangible things too, but trying to discern what that really is beyond the limitations in terms of human ability to perceive and understand it. That's the real challenge. I think before we can really reconcile with whatever UAP might represent, we've got to overcome a few hurdles in terms of human understanding and our limitations therein. That's really, I think, and again, coming back to the whole aspect of, find the good question, ask the right question before
Right.
you concern yourself with the answer. The problem with not doing that is that if you ask the wrong question, but you answer it correctly, the conclusion that you are
Sure.
brought to, of course, is not going to be useful if you didn't ask the right question in the first place. So that's where we are, and that's what we have to try and do.
No, no, exactly. Well, maybe we'll never know. Anyway, yeah, that's just my personal take on it. I mean, I've seen, as you know, as I've said, very strange, inexplicable things in the sky in my earlier years, and I've always wondered what they were. And I've had access, behind the scenes, and you know, I've never met anyone behind the scenes who claimed, as others have, that yeah, there's a crashed UFO and we have it, right, and we have the alien bodies at Area 51. Now, in fact, I've been usually what I'm told about that is that that's propaganda.
Oh, right.
It's part of propaganda, and against whom? Well, against the whole world and against potential enemies, and so it's the same dynamic, right, that obtained and existed during the Cold War,
Mhm.
right, basically. So that's one of the possibilities, right? So it's fascinating, I guess. To wrap this up, right, again, I would end with, the most intriguing aspect of all of this subject is really to get away from the UAP UFO thing and then just go to the possibility of other intelligence in the universe, and the epistemological barriers that we would face in trying to recognize its presence, its existence, and trying to communicate with it. I think at least for me, that's far more interesting than having my sci-fi fantasies, which were instilled, in me through television, like everyone else in the world, it seems, being wish fulfillment, basically. I think that's a better track to go, is to examine, and do thought experiments, right? And try to become a little more humble as human beings, and to maybe expand the tools that SETI is using, and just not radio waves, but come on, let's think outside the box and come up with some other strategies here. All
Yeah.
right. All right. Thanks so much, Micah.
My pleasure as always. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Sure.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.